the hometown crowd. I guess we can sit.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the University of Delaware. I'm Dennis Hassanis. I'm honored to be the university's president. And we are truly delighted to bring to you today the Biden Institute's first event for the fall semester, a panel discussion entitled Choosing a Future of Quality Jobs. This is an incredibly important topic of discussion today, especially in light of the demographic and technological changes that are transforming our society and our economy. Higher education is the engine of economic development and for creating quality jobs. And when we talk about quality jobs, the advantages are obvious. They offer good pay, good benefits, and opportunities for advancement. But most importantly, they offer a chance to contribute in a meaningful way toward building a stronger community. We all want quality jobs. But creating that future depends on the choices our society makes today. Choices about public policies, financial incentives, access to education, and support for the research and innovations that will drive our economy forward. And that's the focus of our discussion today. I know it'll be a fascinating conversation, and we want everyone to participate. This event is being streamed online, and it's being live tweeted at UD Biden Institute. We encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter by using hashtag Future of Work and hashtag American Jobs. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the amazing panel of experts that we have on this topic today. And I'll be very brief on my introduction, so I give them a little time to talk. So we have, and please hold your applause to the end, the Honorable Elaine Chao. We're really thrilled to have you here. U.S. Secretary of Transportation and former U.S. Secretary of Labor. Let's give her a hand. Mary Kay Henry, President of the Service Employees International Union, the SEIU. Jim Murren, Chairman and CEO of MGM Resorts International. We are also going to be joined by Byron Auguste, President and co-founder of Opportunity at Work and a former National Economic Council advisor in the White House. He's actually driving from New York where he was attending a UN Assembly meeting. Good luck to him. He'll be here shortly. Unfortunately, the Honorable Penny Pritzker, former Secretary of Commerce, who you might recall, came to our campus this past fall to announce a $70 million award on biopharmaceutical innovation that we received from Manufacturing USA. She's not able to join today. She offers her regrets, but she'll be back to campus soon. But of course, we do have with us our great host, our most distinguished alum, a proud blue hen from the class of 1965, the 47th Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
My name is Joe Biden, and I am Valerie Biden's brother, who graduated 2 years later with honors, and I graduated. I see a lot of familiar faces out there. I am, as those of you who have been either deployed or been away, it's always good to come home. And this brings back such incredible memories, being here in this, in Mitchell Hall. We used to call this E52. There used to be a course called E52. I don't know if it's still around, is it? But since I had absolutely no talent, I never came here. But all kidding aside, so then to the deans that are here, I will not take the time because I want to get to our panelists and to so many distinguished guests that are here. The Biden Institute is has been set up with a largesse and support, and I appreciate it immensely from the board of directors and the leadership of Dr. and Mrs. Asanas. What we intend to do, and I think we're doing and can only increase, is we intend the Institute to be the intellectual center for scholars, for policymakers and activists and national leaders to come here and have our students in the community benefit from their perspectives. Some of them you'll agree with, some you will not agree with, but to get a sense of the scope of some of the issues that are at stake. And our mission is to help shape and influence the work on some of the nation's toughest domestic issues, which will be our focus. Excuse me, I have a very bad cold. And that's why we're here today. Today we're launching an effort to tackle one of the biggest challenges we now face. And quite frankly, the extent of which is a challenge is unknown to anyone right now. There are estimates that range all over the board, as your professors will tell you. And that is the question of whether or not there will be the consequence of Moore's Law, digitalization, artificial intelligence, globalization, and a whole range of other things, whether or not there will be middle-class jobs available in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And, as many of you know, I'm always, Delawareans have had to put up with me for a long time quoting Irish poets. And everybody thinks I do it because I'm Irish. I am, but I do it because they're simply the best poets. But there's a great line. I just came back from Ireland on Monday night and meeting with the Taoiseach and other members about Brexit and some other things. And there's a line, they celebrated last year, the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising, 1916. There's a poem that Yeats wrote, and there's a line in the poem I think better describes our country today and the world we're in today than it did his Ireland in 1916, in the first Easter Sunday Rising. It says, goes like this, that all's changed utterly. A terrible beauty has been born. A terrible beauty has been born. As I've read that from my English professors here at the University of Delaware to today, the way I and most people interpret his line is that it's still within our control. It can be terrible or it can be really beautiful, but the world is changing. And up to now, humankind, and be parochial here in the United States, we've always been able to bend change to the greater good. Sometimes taking longer times than others, but in the previous 3 industrial revolutions, we were able to bend it to benefit the well-being of average Americans, people around the world. And the question is that, though, that these changes are generated, as you saw in the last election, I'm not making a political comment, and I mean that sincerely. But one of the things that has occurred is that, the people, white males between the ages of 40 and 48, are the only people in America whose life expectancy is declining. And now, those of you who know me know I come out of the black movement, for real. I come out of the civil rights movement. But what's happened is that they have the highest suicide rates of any group of people, including in the hood or on college campuses, the highest abuse of opioids and drugs of any cadre of people in the United States of America, including in the tough neighborhoods. And they also have the highest divorce rate. There's a sense of depression, an unease, an unarticulated unease. Because some of them look at the future, and a lot of them are very, very bright people, and wonder where they fit in the future. Their whole lives they have spent accomplishing a living standard and a circumstance for their families that is now very much in jeopardy. The fact is that this change is, as always great change is, it is unsettling, particularly in some sectors. And so there have been a couple ideas that have come forward as to how to deal with the displacement that has occurred and additional displacement that may occur, is likely to occur, as a consequence of the changing economic factors around the world. Elaine, the Secretary, has forgotten more about this than most people know. And wherever you go in the world, we have the same discussions, don't we? With Republican, Democrat, the same questions in every country. And so what do we do? There are some ideas that are coming out of now, those of you who are economic students, out of Silicon Valley for a guaranteed lifetime wage for displaced workers. Led by, I was on the phone with 3 of the CEOs of the largest companies today, led by names that if I mentioned, I didn't get permission to use their names, so I won't. Led by the leaders in the Valley, making tens of billions of dollars. But one of the questions is that the appropriate approach? If there's pace on the ball and Moore's Law continues to be in play, which was predicted to have petered out 5-6 years ago. Digitalization. I have a good acquaintance with Eric Schmidt, Google. He's working with me on what is the role of artificial intelligence and how do societies adjust to the emergence of artificial intelligence. And so, but my dad had an expression, our dad. He was a graceful, well-read high school graduate. And he used to say when he had to come to Wilmington from Scranton, Pennsylvania to find work, and we lived with my grandpop for a little over a year and a half, the family. He used to say after that, when someone would lose a job in a recession in our neighborhood, we lived in Claymont, we lived in middle-class neighborhoods, and when there was a recession, somebody in our neighborhood, somebody around our dining room table lost their job. I remember the first time I heard him say it, but he'd say, Joey, a job's about a lot more than a paycheck. It's about your dignity. It's about your respect. It's about your place in your community. It's about controlling your life. And then he'd end by saying, it's about being able to look your child in the eye and say, honey, it's going to be okay. So part of me, in this debate discussion we're going to be having, a guaranteed minimum wage for those people who are accustomed to working hard their whole lives, it may allow them to pay their rent, and it may be necessary depending on what happens. Pay their rent, put food on the table, have their health care. What about their dignity? I think the defining notion of the idea of America was that everyone, and I mean this sincerely, everyone, no matter what their station, is entitled to be treated with dignity. With dignity. And so there's guys like me who went out there saying, we're in the administration, that part of the answer lies in continuing education. Does anybody in this beautiful hall believe that 12 years of education is enough to make it in the 21st century? Not a joke. It's not. What separated us from the rest of the world at the turn of the 20th century is we were the first nation in the world to have universal education, not means tested. You could be a millionaire or a pauper, and you got 12 years of free education. That's the thing that set us apart from every other nation in the world. Well, the world's caught up. It's caught up. No nation had that. If we were doing this for the first time today, deciding on universal education we needed, do you think we would have said it'd only be 12 years? I don't think so. I'm one of those guys who thinks that there should be a minimum of 14 years of free education, not means tested. We can argue about how we afford it or can't afford it. That's a discussion to have. But my generic point is this. Those of you who are physics students or astrophysicists, you can graduate with a doctorate this spring. And unless you have a continuing education, you're going to be obsolete in 10 years. The knowledge you've acquired thus far will not take you through the enormous change that's going to take place in the near term. People, to live a middle-class life, it's more about their security and standard of living than it is about any particular number. I'm referred to, as Elaine probably knows, I'm referred to for the last 35 years in Washington as middle-class Joe. It's not meant as a compliment. It means I'm not sophisticated. But I'm pretty damn sophisticated about the middle class. I think the single defining feature of the United States of America's political and social stability has been an ever-growing middle class. I've spent more time with President Xi Jinping than any leader in the world. I've had 25 hours of private dinners with him. There's he and I, and each have an interpreter. Traveled 18,000 miles with him in China because his president, President Hu, and my president, President Obama, thought we should get to know one another. And we were in Chengdu, a city that was, I think, 4 million 25 years ago, now 22 million. I don't know the numbers, but it's gigantic change. And he looked at me and said, "Can you define America for me?" And I said, "Yes, I can, Mr. President, in one word, and I mean it. Possibilities." Just a single word, possibilities. No other place in the world is stamped into your DNA, whether you are naturalized or native born, the notion that in here, anything's possible. We lose that. We lose the raison d'etat for this experiment, in my view. And so, I want to get to doing what I'm going to be doing today, and I'm going to be having a discussion with my colleagues here and asking them their views on a whole range of things. And so the question is, as I'm joined by these leaders on stage here, and Penny Pritzker does send her regrets. She's a really solid person. And when the president asked me to put together a report on jobs of the future, Penny literally went out, and of the Fortune 500 CEOs, she met with over 320 of them. And she is a CEO in her own right. But we have an incredible group here. All of these people have played a role in helping support or design programs that train workers for jobs that are available today. And all of them are to some degree or another, have some anxiety about what will those jobs be in the future. Let me talk about, and I hope Elaine will forgive me, Secretary Chao, she and I have been friends for a while. Her husband and I, he's a Republican leader, probably one of the most gifted tacticians I've ever worked with, and I've worked with a lot, 36 years in the Senate and 8 years as vice president. Very, very straightforward, traditional conservative, and I'm very much a progressive, and we're friends. If you notice, every time there was a crisis in our administration, who were the two people who were expected to settle it? Not a joke. Her husband, majority leader, and me. But this woman comes from an incredible stock. Her dad emigrated with virtually nothing from China as a very young man. She has an exceptional mother and father who's brilliant. A sister who's equally as talented, graduated from Harvard as well, and we have slightly different ideologies, but we have the same value set. She's former, as was pointed out, Secretary of Labor, now our Secretary of Transportation. And I have some questions for her as well. Also, Byron, who's somewhere between 34th Street and the tunnel. Well, I'll go on. When he comes, I'll talk about him. Mary Kay Henry. Mary Kay doesn't like to admit this, but I'm her favorite public official of all time. All time. Even though when I was thinking of running for president, she was going to endorse Hillary, I hadn't announced, but I know it would have been broken her heart had I announced, right? Right, Mary Kay? Okay. But Mary Kay runs a union that has 2 million members and works every single day of her life to make the life conditions of those workers and everyone they come in contact with, from make sure they have basic opportunities. And the interesting thing about Mary Kay, and I hope my two other guests don't object, I'm a labor guy. And one of the things I admire about Mary Kay and her union and others is she's led the fight on a $15 minimum wage. Not a single one of her members makes less than $15. She spends hundreds of thousands of dollars, thousands of man and women hours organizing to try to make life better for people who are never going to join the union, who are no part of the union, but because it's the right thing to do. The last person I want to introduce has become a good friend. Jim Murren runs a little outfit called MGM Resorts International. I was talking to Jim, there's a famous fountains outside their main facility, and I was told by the way, the only thing about him, he's a kleptomaniac when it comes to staff. I had a colonel who was with me for years, my military aide, a C-17 pilot, brilliant guy, named Flinney. I thought Flinney was going to stay with me. I thought we were going to get him here. Jim stole him, okay? And I have another brilliant young woman here with him today who did press for me. Jim stole her, too. As a matter of fact, Jim, I have great influence with Delaware State Police. You're under arrest. But 40 million people stand in that plaza and take a look at what's going on. And the thing about Jim is that he has 77,000 employees. Average salary, $45,000 a year. You can live a middle-class life on that salary. One of the top retention rates in the industry, with an average tenure when hired of 8 years. 8 years. CEOs don't last that long these days, not a joke. And he offers employees 12-week and 1-year management training programs. He, like many enlightened companies today, are deciding that the way to save money and increase efficiency is train and pro from within. And that's what he does. But I call it giving people hope. So we have an extraordinary panel, in my view. I'm going to start off asking a few questions. I hope they will engage and ask questions as well. And then we're going to turn to all of you and hear what questions you have on your mind. And if we get too boring, just get up and walk out. But I'm assuming if you stay, you think we're on the right track, okay? Thank you very much. We'll start off. We have a microphone. What I'd like to do, if I can, is, Madam Secretary?
Yes.
You have had 2 significant posts in 2 different administrations in the cabinet. And you have worked very hard to promote the industry, the transportation industry, which, as the Secretary will tell you, we rank, unfortunately now, we rank 17th in the world. We're having the most modern infrastructure in transportation. 17th, United States of America. And what's the main focus you are zeroing in on in terms of changing and growing the environment in which you regulate?
We have 3 goals. Number 1 is safety. Safety is number 1, and it is the underlying value that girds everything that we do. Number 2 is the infrastructure. As the Vice President mentioned, our deteriorating infrastructure potentially impacts our country's economic vitality, productivity, economic competitiveness. Any one of us that have been delayed at airports, in the air, on rail, and in our congested highways, we all recognize the need to rebuild, refurbish our infrastructure. And part of that is dealing also with the air traffic control. So the second part of our thematic work is how to deal with the infrastructure. And the third is the future. And that is where this forum is so important, because the future involves autonomous vehicles, drones, artificial intelligence. Right now, we basically have self-driving, technically at least, self-driving planes, cars, ships, railways. Now, we're in a very rudimentary level, but that day is coming. So as a former Secretary of Labor, who now am in the transportation sector, seeing all this new technology and how it impacts employment, I'm very concerned about finding solutions for the potential displacement that new technology can result. By the way, I wish you were there, you would stand up there and talk forever. I could have listened.
She's very kind, but not true. Can I follow up on that for just a second? Good to see you. By the way, he never showed up late when he was working with the administration. I just want you to know. Good to see you, man. Thank you. Great drive down, huh?
Yeah, that was actually, once you got out of New York, was pretty good, like Manhattan.
The congestion.
By the way, I was late to speak at a conference that Dean Sonnenfeld put on this morning that you were invited to speak to, and you were kind enough to come here in Washington on their School of Management. And I was late as well. And you know, when I was a young senator, before I was a senator, I worked really hard on congestion on the highway. And then as a senator, I did. Then I got elected vice president and found out there was no congestion. There was none. And hell, now the Secret Service is gone, there's congestion. I don't know how the hell that works, but at any rate. But Elaine, one of the things that you've spent a lot of time, all of us have spent some time focusing on, is, for example, we lost 120,000 bank tellers over the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years. They were making an average of $21,000 a year. But now, I don't have my cell phone, I gave it to my staff, but that cell phone you have, most of you do your banking on that cell phone. Now, you need people to program that. You need 31,000 to 32,000 replacing the 121,000. Instead of making 21, they're making 48. But there's a lot of people who are left. And so what I know you've looked at is that when an industry is revolutionized, like self-driving trucks, automobiles, it seems to me that it's going to require a significantly different infrastructure on the highways.
Yes.
That is going to require a whole new cadre of workers to build it and maintain it. So is there any, not person for person, truck driver going to working on,
But that's what the federal training program should be about. So I am very much of the belief, and I want to believe this, and I do, is that with the displacement of technology, new jobs will be created, just as you mentioned, that there will be different kinds of workers and skill sets required. So the big challenge for the workforce and for employers and for the public sector is the changing nature of work. Work is becoming more and more highly skilled, and information technology is increasingly important. 88% now of jobs require some understanding of information technology. So it is really important for workers, number one, to stay in school, and then once they get out of school, number two, they've got to constantly train themselves, keep abreast of new information, and constantly update themselves. And the jobs of the future are getting more and more sophisticated. And I mean, I can't even work the iPhone for the longest time. I mean, someone was so genius and so brilliant as to invent that thing, and then it took me like a month to figure out how to use it, just to use it.
It took my granddaughter a day.
Yes.
No, not a joke. You think I'm joking. I'm not.
And so it is also age correlated. So when we talk about federal training programs, we have to make sure that they're flexible, that they're responsive, and that they're also demand-driven, meaning that our federal training programs have to train people for jobs that actually exist. And so that's a big challenge. But these jobs are going to be there, but they're going to be more sophisticated, require higher skills, and we've got a responsibility to help those who are caught in the transition, to help them transition to either different kinds of training opportunities, different kinds of jobs, but the transition, and those who you mentioned, especially those who are of a certain age, a certain population, they are the most hurt and the most anxious.
Well, you know, maybe we should have your father answer this question. Her dad emigrated from China in '58, and he was a ship captain. He turned that into an incredibly successful group, the foremost group in terms of trading and a finance company. But every job out there.
He's a great philanthropist too.
No, he's an incredible philanthropist. But let me ask you all a question generally. One of the things I find that happens, and it happens, I've had the great honor of being able to speak at an awful lot of universities over the years and met some brilliant academics, and some very sophisticated people I've worked with in public life and in the business sector. And maybe this is just me, but it's a question for y'all. I find that there are some very well-informed people who don't think the average working guy with a high school education has the capacity to make this transition. Now, maybe I'm wrong. That's been kind of our experience we found. That there's this sense that, well, you know, the guy who used to throw coals into a blast furnace, he can't learn how to program. And yet you look around, as you were saying, Elaine, you look around at the iPhone. The most uneducated people in terms of formal education don't know how to work at all. I remember when we first put computers in our homes as senators, we thought it was they didn't want to spend the money. And I'm working on a computer in my library, and it froze. And my little 9-year-old granddaughter's behind me. She said, "Oh, Pop, she called it imputer. Is your imputer frozen?" I said, "Yes." She needs to go, boom, 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 boom. She walked out the room. So what do you hear when you talk about transition? Do you hear people, are they skeptical that we can train people to new disciplines? Do they have the cognitive capability? Just because they were doing manual labor, does that mean, is there a prejudice thinking they can't do the cognitive work that needs to be done for these basic jobs? Byron?
I personally think there is quite a bit of, I think prejudices would be a fair word to describe it. I think that people confuse, people confuse levels of education and how many years of school with what skills you have, with what you can do. And when people say, like, you don't have enough skills, they usually mean you haven't gone to school enough years. And in fact, while those are related, they're not at all the same thing. So in the work we've been doing with Opportunity at Work, I mean, we're dealing with folks who might not have the credentials, right, the college degree, the work experience, et cetera, that you would for information technology occupations. But most of the people we're working with actually already have the skills. They picked it up in the Navy, right? If you're a secretary in a business, 15, 20 people, and you have any knack for this at all, you're going to become the IT department because there's no IT department. But now you try to apply for a job in IT, a career path in IT, well, you're going to get screened out because like you didn't have the right degrees, maybe you didn't go to college, maybe you, and so I just think the bias we have that says that formal education is the only way to acquire quote unquote advanced skills. I think it's a huge mistake. I think we're wasting an enormous amount of talent. I see people every day who say, I know what I can do, but no one will give me a chance. And really what we're doing at Opportunity at Work in this Tech Hire Initiative is say, show what you can do, and the jobs can look for you. Because in fact, the current system is really inefficient. People apply for 300 jobs, 500 people apply for each job, and companies say, well, we don't have the time, it's too expensive to really assess what they can do, so we have to screen them out. But so they come to us, we can spend 10 times as much assessing their skills, and it's still 30 times more efficient because they don't have to do it 300 times. So I think there's actually some simple solutions that aren't about fixing people. There's not that much wrong with people, honestly, but it's fixing our institutions. So,
when the president asked me, and there was a bipartisan consensus on this, the president asked me, I always, State of the Unions are always exciting times, but we never knew what the hell he was going to turn on and say, Joe will do. Oh, you think I'm kidding? I'm not. Joe will do the moonshot. Thanks for telling me, Mr. President. You know, Joe will do jobs of the future. Thank you, Mr. President. Joe will handle the Recovery Act. Thank you, Mr. President. I think he got a kick out of seeing whether the reaction on television to my face is, what in the hell?
I think we call that skills-based hiring.
Yes.
You weren't credentialed. You weren't credentialed.
Well, but here,
Rose to the challenge.
Here's the point. And I'd like you, and Jim, you hire a lot of technically low-skilled in terms of education people. Detroit. I spent a lot of time in Detroit because my economic advisor was the guy that we took from the Treasury Department, you know, Don, and sent him to Detroit and lent him to the mayor of Detroit for a year to help him find out every single program that they're eligible to, places they hadn't taken advantage of, et cetera. And Detroit was getting up off its back, sort of onto its heels, and beginning to move a little bit, and it's moving now. And they found out they were short, Jim, 1,000 employees in the city to turn the lights on, off, water, et cetera, with IT skills. Now, this report says we're going to need 2.2 million additional people competent in IT by the year 2022. And so there's a, Steph, I always forget the name of it, the outfit that does the, it's a global, what's it called? Global USA. And it's an outfit that if you were looking for an IT worker in your, you probably use them, Jim, you'd go to them and they'd hire. They have these skilled workers, the workers have been trained. So we, and Mitch helped on this, we decided that we were going to have a program in the Department of Labor where we would take monies, give them to community colleges, let businesses come in and say, this is the skill I need, and let them come in and set the curriculum up for that course. They wouldn't get a degree, but they would get a certificate in that particular area. So what happened was they went out, and I'll make this short, they found 58 women from the hood, and I mean the hood. Not one woman had more than a high school degree, and almost half had GEDs. They ranged in age from 24 to 58. I went out for the graduation. Every one of them, after 19 weeks, was hired, and the lowest starting wage was $57,000 a year, and the highest $108,000. Because think about it, guys. All the high school, you all went to high school, obviously. You have a science and math requirement. You couldn't take programming and qualify. That wouldn't count. You don't, there's only 5% of the high schools in America that teach anybody that. So the generic point I'm making is that I was encouraged to see that people with no educational skill but cognitive capability were able to, with targeted programs, be able to do a job. Dow Kokum hiring 40,000 people, and they spent it failed, not because of the workers, but no one knew how to use a photovoltaic machine on the floor of the shop, the assembly line. So we brought them in. They set up a curricula at I think it was Macomb County Community College, and it was a conveyor belt initially until the company had other problems. Starting salary $54,000 a year. And so, Jim, when you look at, and I know you're in the service business, but talk to me about why have you been able to be, I understand why you theoretically be successful because the revenue generated by what you do, but why have you been able to do what a lot of corporations don't do? Why have you decided to, in effect, spread the wealth?
Well, Mr. Vice President, it's an honor to be here, and Madam Secretary and my panel. I think just a moment, to say MGM is in the service business would be like saying Apple makes phones, or Google is a search engine, or Disney's Mickey Mouse. I have over 2,000 different kinds of jobs within my company. I have many manufacturing jobs. We have our own wood shops and print shops and paint shops. We have our own engineers and technicians. We have a tremendously large IT department, cybersecurity department. I hire hundreds of MBAs a year. But the Vice President's point is a good one about Detroit, where I do have a property. It takes a force of will from the top to hire locally. We have 3,000 employees in the city of Detroit, and I hired over half of them from the city of Detroit. Many of them were underemployed or unemployed. I just need willing people, and I will provide the skills. Of my 78,000 employees, half of them are union, and my great partners right here with a culinary. The other half are non-union. When we opened up in Maryland not long ago, visit MGM National Harbor, commercial, I had
Stole my kernel.
Yes.
Go there.
So I had 4 years to find the right folks. I didn't wait 4 years. I went out to the vocational schools, to Prince George's Community College. We allowed everybody to go online and say, what kind of job would you like? Then put in your skills. And they could immediately find the gaps that they have. Certifications they need to get, training they need to be provided, and we help them get that. Companies that say they can't find qualified workers, they're not trying hard enough. And they're not making the effort that MGM makes. Of my employees, I hire as locally as possible. I train them throughout their entire life. And I find sources of great value. You mentioned veterans. I've hired 2,500 veterans. The best trained men and women in the world are coming from our military. Why wouldn't companies like I put them to work? Women in the workforce. The majority of my employees are minorities, 65% of them. 3 of my 10 board members are female, and before I retire, the majority of my board members are going to be female because we know women are smarter than men, and I want to have as many of them as I can. And I think my final point on it is my jobs can't be outsourced. You know, I create jobs here in the United States, sometimes 3,000 and 4,000 at a time, like National Harbor, 4,000 jobs. Springfield, Massachusetts, that once proud, gritty city, 3,000 new jobs next year alone. those folks are coming from Western Massachusetts. And in this world that we're in today, travel and tourism is critical. The Secretary and I have discussed this. And having pathways to the middle class is absolutely vital, as I agree with the Vice President. And it's up to companies like mine to help provide that pathway. And I'm always hiring. So applications will be right outside for folks looking for jobs, because I have at any given time 500-600 open positions in my company. And all I need is willing people. I'll help you get trained.
By the way, he's not kidding. No, I'm not joking. He is not kidding. If anyone on my staff goes outside, I'm going to kill you. Mary Kay? Oh, I'm sorry. No, did you?
Could I don't want to get in the way, but I just wanted to say it's really interesting listening to you, because what's so striking to me is what you just described, the way you think about your workforce, the training, your responsibility to the community. That would be a relatively normal position for an American business, say 30 years ago. I mean, that would be like normal, right? And I think as specifically as it relates to hiring, you go back 40 years or so, the data's not that great, but probably about half of all hiring is entry-level hiring, meaning, you hire someone out of high school, out of college, first job, and they kind of work their way through the company. So maybe it's a little less, but it's in that order of magnitude. But we've gone to a point where, did you know only 7% of hiring now is entry-level hiring? 93% of hiring is some version of, you need 8 years of experience in these kind of roles, and you need this degree and everything, where it's like really, really specific. And so when you combine that with the fact that, as you mentioned, jobs are changing and skills are changing, I mean, you create a job that really only existed the last year or two, and then you put a job description that says what someone has to have done the last 10 years of their life to even be considered. Right. Well, until Elon Musk or someone invents a time machine, like, we got a problem, right? I mean, that's not, no one can deal with that. We're essentially defining half of the people as being not having the right profile for the job before we've even seen what they can do. And if we keep doing that, well, we're going to optimize our way off a cliff, and I think that's really what's going on. So I think what we need to look at harder isn't just the skills people have, because everybody knows they need more skills, and everybody wants more skills, and people are willing to work for that. That's not news. But what's really happening is that we have a set of institutions like labor market hiring practices, again, to which this is a real exception, what you described, that really, I think, are preventing people from doing their best work. How many people can say, if I work hard at X, I can learn Y and I can get to job Z? I know I can, I just got to go for it. I think at least half of Americans don't, like, not just kids in school, but adults, like, don't have an A, B, an X, Y, and Z for that. They don't know. And so until, the first thing we got to do is to stop prejudging what people can do and let people show what they can do. And I think we can do a lot once we start doing that, but until we start doing that, I think we've really got a problem.
Well, you have a good point, because, I mean, that was when companies were company towns, right? The company would be built, the town would grow up. That actually is an advantage we have. When we go in, we become the company town. So we're going to be the largest employer in Springfield, Massachusetts. We're one of the largest employers in Detroit today. We are obviously the largest employer in Las Vegas, one of the largest employers in Prince George's in Maryland. Mm-hmm. And then when you go in with that mindset, you go in with a sustainability mindset. How do you not only get the employees you need today, but to develop the employees for the future? And if you're committed to hire underemployed or unemployed locals, then you're going to have training. You just have to be able to, but I will tell you on this point, I know it costs a lot of money to do it. The reason why companies don't do it, it costs money. The reason why they don't do it is it costs money. The reason why they should do it, it's costing them more money by not doing it, because their retention rates are lower, they have higher turnover than I do, and their employees are not as engaged, not as loyal. And in the millennial world today, for those millennials like my son over there, they don't care about how long they've been at a company. It's all about, does this company have the core values, the culture that aligns with my core values and my culture? And companies that get get the fact that they have to develop a culture that is conducive to the workforce are succeeding, whether you're in manufacturing or in the service world, the companies that don't get it, that think that you have to pay your dues and go up the corporate ladder, are the ones that are going obsolete.
Mary Kay, from the perspective of organized labor, you listen to this conversation. What are the thoughts that have been running through your mind about the impact upon the people the 2 million people you represent and the millions of others who depend on them? I mean, what in your view has sort of happened? There used to be a basic bargain in America, as I said. If you contributed to the well-being of the enterprise which you were a part of, you got to participate. It was Republican Democrats. We all believed this when I first started. You got to participate in the profits. As I said, you had from the end of World War II to 1979, productivity was up 92%, wages up 91%. From 78 or 79 to 2013, productivity up, I think it was 67%, wages up 8%. What happened on the way to the forum here? I mean, I'm not being, let me start, I should say my prejudice. I don't think business or people who, wealthy shareholders of Wall Street said, let's screw workers, let's figure out how to do that. I don't think that. But something has happened, many things have happened, that put you at an enormous disadvantage in being able to provide a living, decent, middle-class wage for the people you and all your colleagues who are my friends represent. So talk to me a little bit.
Mr. Vice President, you are the single elected official in this nation that has consistently spoke to the answer to the question. So I'm going to answer what I've heard you say in other settings, but I just want to honor your terribly consistent leadership on this issue, which is you've always recognized that working people having an organized voice in the economy and the democracy was key to shared prosperity. Those rising wages and increased productivity were when working people were joining unions, and when 30% of American workers had a voice through unions, we were sharing prosperity. And the thing that I dream about listening to this panel that you have always imagined is, what if government key CEOs and working people through unions were able to think about a transition from the service economy that we currently are to the technology information age economy? Because when you said the thing earlier about what about the worker that's been displaced, that's used to manufacturing, do you believe that it's their lack of skill? And when you think about your father's story, when you think about Secretary Chao's story, the story of all of our families, I think it's what you said, it's malarkey, the idea that that individual isn't ready to make a change. Your dad moved from Wilmington to Scranton because he was going to fight for his children. And that's true of every working person in this nation. And we aren't taking advantage of the possibilities that could come from government, employers, and unions working together. In Germany, they're transitioning from a fossil fuel industry where working people earn a middle-class life to solar and wind, because government, the trade union movement, and employers are making the transition together and figuring out how the education that's required in the transition supports people being able to make that transition. We are a country of possibility, as you said, and we can do big things. We have 2 million home care workers in this nation, in the fastest growing job in the service sector, that are living and working in poverty, doing jobs that they love for seniors, people with disability, and kids. And we've had technology, thanks to the Department of Labor and your administration, introduced to home care workers that can reduce hospitalization by 40%, because home care workers get trained on an iPad that allows them to speak to the primary care person. And the original bias was, as Byron said, oh, these 58-year-old women of color, they're going to be afraid of the iPad. They haven't used it their entire working life. They loved the iPad. And it was a tool that made their job better and reduced healthcare costs at the same time. And so that's just like one tiny example of millions of examples that when working people are believed in by people like you, and our basic dignity at work is a part of the way that you've just spoken about. I think we can do big things as a nation, but the inability of working people to be able to join together and have a voice with our government and with our employers limits, I think, our imagination on these big transitions in the workplace.
One of the things, Elaine, that there is a political disagreement on, legitimate, is that I was amazed to learn how many non-compete agreements there are out there that our employees have to sign. I thought they were all somebody working for Google. You know, I'm not going to compete. But there are tens of thousands of non-compete agreements that are signed by people flipping hamburgers. Yeah. High school educated people making the minimum wage. And what it does, because those people don't get up and move to a different place, it gives enormous power to the employer to set the conditions in which they work. Because you leave, I'm not being literal, but you leave McDonald's, you can't go to Burger King. Now, I was stunned when I found that out. Some of your economic professors could probably tell me, I don't know the total dollar consequence of that. I don't know. But the other thing is that, and you had to deal with Elaine when you were Secretary of Labor, is this issue of reclassification. When you are management, you're not paid overtime, nor am I arguing you should be. When you are non-management, you are paid overtime. It's based on an hourly wage. And the imagination of what constitutes management now has proliferated in a big way. And I'll raise two other things, and then maybe you can start, Elaine, and ask you guys to chime in. I think a lot of things happen, the unintended consequences of certain actions that occur. I have a cartoon that my staff kept taking off. You've seen it, Mary Kay. In my office as vice president, now it's in my office in Washington. A picture of a great big guy and a fat guy in really rotund, wearing a black turtleneck sweater, a black beret, and a black mask. And he's sitting at a table being interrogated by a policeman. And there's a great big bag of money. There's a dollar sign on it. And it's from the New Yorker. Underneath it says, the robber looking at the police officer, how was I to know he was the job creator? So we started to see, and I don't think it was any plot or anything, but my dad used to think that he managed one of the largest automobile dealerships in the state, that he was a job creator, that he actually sold these vehicles and he created jobs for the guy back in the assembly line or the woman in the office doing the accounting or whatever. But there was an interesting study done by a professor at University of Massachusetts, published in the Harvard Business Journal. And he went back and looked at 448 corporations who had been in the Fortune 500, stayed in the Fortune 500 all these years, from 2003 to 2013. And they made, don't hold me to the exact number, I'll get it for you, I think $2.1 trillion. I can't remember the numbers, it's trillions, which is a good thing. And then he looked at how they used the money they made. Yeah. And 54% of it went to buy back their own stock. And 35% went to dividends. two numbers larger than ever occurred before, leaving 9% for everything else. Expansion, raises, job training, research, development. Now, there's a lot of reasons for it. I'm not suggesting globalization has changed it, maximizing the value of the share to be able to continue to compete internationally, all those reasons. But I ask myself, why is it that no one, shouldn't say no one, very few Fortune 500 companies are spending any money in training employees? And yet today at this Yale conference, you know the folks there better than I did, Elaine, but they're all CEOs of major corporations.
This is Professor Jeff Sonnenfeld of Yale's Yale CEO Forum. It's very good.
And we had Jeff here to participate in the issue of long-termism versus short-termism in corporate America. But here's the point. Every one of those guys and women, there weren't enough men, but there were women, every one of them, if I asked them what they needed most, they'd said to me, I need a better trained workforce. And virtually none of them were spending my money on retraining. So I couldn't figure out why that was. When DuPont acquired Conoco, they retrained. When they did, I mean, we're from a company state. Mm-hmm. And by the way, they've been great pub, although now it's fundamentally different. When I was elected to the Senate in 1972, DuPont Company was the 8th largest corporation in the world. Now it's somewhere in the hundreds. Or maybe it was 87, I don't know, but it's much, much smaller. So the question, are there any things that have occurred in the regulatory process or government action that have occurred that the cumulative effect has been to make it more difficult for both the company to function, employees to have a voice within the company, and growth to be the overarching rationale for what they're doing? It used to be that the average tenure of a CEO, I think, was 9 years, Jim? Yep. It's now, what, 4.5, 5 years?
Shorter.
No, it's even shorter, isn't it? Yeah, it is.
I'm on borrowed time.
So, and by the way, I take blame for this. I was there all this time. I voted for an idea that Bill Clinton had that was, we both, in respect to a stupid idea. Public held corporations couldn't deduct in their taxes more than $1 million than paying to a CEO. So the market incentivizes. So now, something like 87% of all the CEO's salary is paid by stock dividends. So if that's the case, if you own 10 shares of stock and they're worth $1 a piece and you buy back 5, it's more you're going to be worth about $1.25, $1.30. If that's how you're getting paid, it's not a bad way to work. So what I'm trying to get...
In other contexts, that would be called self-dealing, by the way.
Well, by the way, it is and it isn't. There's a lot of self-dealing we do in public life. There's a lot of self-dealing in academia. There's a lot of self-dealing in everything. But the question is, are there any things you guys see, and I'm going to stop talking, anything you guys can see out there that if we were to either administratively or legislatively alter, we would generate growth? That's the whole thing that our whole tax structure has been designed to do. Two things for a tax expenditure. One, does it promote a social good, charitable contribution? Deducting your home mortgage, there wouldn't be middle-class folks who own their own homes. Also, if you increase productivity, if you take a risk and it works, you get the benefit. Capital gains, you don't pay the same tax rate. But I look at all these things, and I'm trying to figure it out like a Rubik's Cube. When Reagan was president, there were $800 billion in tax loopholes, as you would call them, but they're tax expenditures. Probably 600 of them were worthwhile. They either promoted people taking risks and/or they promoted the social good. But now there are over $1.3 trillion not collected, ordinarily would be collected today. Kind of what sort of happened? A lot of it may have to do with globalization and all these things we talked about. I'll just give you one little example. You know, if you increased If you made community college free, you'd increase the GDP 0.2% per year. You'd go from 6 million people in community college to 9 million, assuming they're qualified, 9 million. But it costs $6 billion a year to do it. If you eliminated one tax loophole called stepped-up basis, I didn't know what it was for the longest time because I was always listed the poorest guy in the Congress. But stepped-up basis means you go out and you buy a stock, it increases from $1 million to $2 million bucks. You're going to sell it, you're going to pay capital gains on the $1 million you made. But on the way to the farm to sell it, you get hit by a truck, God forbid, and your son inherits it. He pays no tax on that. It's not about inheritance. That costs the government every year $17 billion a year. Eliminating that one tax expenditure out of over $1.3 trillion, I can increase productivity in America by 0.2%, cut in half the cost of college for 9 million students. But we don't talk about this kind of stuff, and I'm not quite sure why. I'm going to hush up and ask any of you to chime in, and what are the things you would do if you were president or you're in Elaine's job and she had carte blanche? What are the things you'd do in business or in labor that you think would be fair to everyone, generate economic growth in the country, and put ordinary working class people in a better position to fend for themselves, notwithstanding all the change taking place? That's a hell of a question. I apologize.
I have three simple ideas. One you said when you were speaking before. When you raise wages in a community, you stimulate growth because people have more money to spend at their grocery store for basic things that people need for their kids, for school. And we've seen it in all of the cities that are on a path to 15. Small business growth is accelerated in the city of Seattle because the large corporations there are going to be paying 15 as of January next year, and then small businesses follow a year later. And that's made a huge difference in the economy. I think the second thing is innovation in cities where we're trying to figure out the next form of 21st century unions, like how do those fast food workers get a chance across McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King to come together and fight for the things they want. So Bill de Blasio and the New York City Council just created a C3 organization where fast food workers will voluntarily join, and their number one issue is education and training. They want to have a conversation across this industry with how does the fast food sector, who employs 4 million people in this country, and CEO pay is 1,200 times the average worker, and they're doing share buybacks instead of investing in the workforce. There's plenty of money in this industry. It's just not prioritized in the way that you're suggesting. And then the final thing is I think we have to end the taxpayer's subsidy of low-wage work. $6,000 to $7,000 a year in taxpayer dollars are going to poverty wage jobs, in contracted jobs in airports, in fast food, in nursing homes where people can't make ends meet even though they're working 80 to 100 hours. And that's 7 to 10 billion. Let's put that in community colleges because all those workers want access to lifelong education, just as the way you're saying. So those are three ideas that I think would be incredibly stimulating, and it requires government, employers, and working people to share our vision and values, I think. In the way that you said Secretary Chao and you share the same values, you may have a different ideology. I feel like we have to return to an understanding that in spite of our differences, we have a basic set of values about the basic bargain, that when you work hard, you ought to be able to lead a decent life.
Could what's most striking to me is how much of the change in behavior, you mentioned a policy, there are other policies that did contribute to these changes, but it's really striking how much isn't policy per se, it's behavior. There used to be things we thought were okay and not okay. And now, like in too many spheres, we think that if it's, well, as long as it's legal or you can get a lawyer to say it's legal, that it's okay, right? But that doesn't make it okay. That doesn't make it consistent with our values. And I have a PhD in economics, which makes it surprising that you and I get along so well because you like to.
I don't know anything about it, and that's why.
But
That's why it works. He says it, and I say, okay, yeah. Right.
But do you know what you understand? What you understand that I think economists don't understand today, because there's a lot of math in economics, and that's kind of how you get to the top of it. Economics wasn't originally about math or optimizing. It was, in fact, about values. Economics is about how you make choices, wise choices, with scarce resources, which scarcity of resources is just a fact of life at all times. So how do you make those choices? And Adam Smith, who gave us The Wealth of Nations and all this view of markets, he also wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He actually wrote it prior to The Wealth of Nations. And the underlying idea of the theory of moral sentiments is that the deepest need people have, even more than sort of money or wealth is to meaning, like to be important, that their lives matter, and that we're social beings, so we experience that by having the esteem of those around us, or people saying thank you, or you need, and that actually, he said a number of times, markets, Wealth of Nations, they can't work. Like, he's sort of assuming that we all understand that we have this bond and we have this responsibility, and so that therefore we have this basic level of trust in how we treat other people, and it's only on top of that that then markets can work, right? Because markets would never work if everybody cheated. What's striking is that, right, most people, only a few people cheat, markets can work. But if everybody says, I'm gonna go to the very edge of what's possible, then you lose trust, and I think it really undermines what's possible. So, for example, everything I'm talking about with this, with the jobs and the way people are run through this kind of, crazy quilt jungle of requirements to apply for a job, nobody passed a law saying you had to do that. I mean, 20% of secretaries have a bachelor's degree today, but 67%, 2/3 of the new jobs for secretaries require a bachelor's degree to be considered. So but there was no law that said businesses have to require a bachelor's degree, but it was just sort of, well, we might get some better people, it'll be more convenient. It's kind of, we have this phenomenon of what's convenient for powerful institutions just flows downhill, right, on not powerful people, and it's death by 1,000 cuts. So you talk about non-compete agreements. Well, it might be a little more convenient for a business, maybe we could hold on to someone a little longer if we have a non-compete agreement, but it is a disaster for the people involved, and by the way, it's terrible for the economy. So you talk about how can we grow faster? Well, the California Supreme Court outlawed non-compete agreements, right? It said they're unenforceable in the state of California, whereas Massachusetts has kept it. That is one of the main reasons why Silicon Valley goes from strength to strength, because the ecosystem is much more powerful, because individuals, right, can find their best. Whereas Massachusetts, that is really strangling the economy there. But that's an example of, just because you have the power to do something, and just because it helps you at the margin, doesn't mean it makes sense to do. And the capital markets problem you talk about is huge, but to be fair to companies, right now, if you look at the incentives of companies, there's a massive incentive towards automation built into our accounting code, built into our tax code. And accounting's not even like laws, right? That's a nonprofit, FASB, who does it. But if you spend the same amount of cash in, same amount of cash out to solve a new problem, and work is solving problems after all, right? To solve a new problem with people and training, and you cross-train them, and you solve that problem, if you spent the same amount of cash on machines and software to solve that problem just as well. So let's say those two were equal. If you did it with machines and software, you could capitalize that, whereas these other ones are an expense. So your earnings look higher, right? Your stock price is higher, to the point you made your executive compensation is much higher. And so over and over and over, and I worked with companies for 2 decades on these decisions, you get the decision at the margin, yeah, we're gonna go with the machines, we're gonna go with the software. Or yes, we need more jobs, but if I spend it in this quarter, my numbers look bad, and therefore, right, I'm not going to do it. And this happens all the time. So if you change that kind of behavior and those systemic incentives, you'd have a lot more investment, because there's a lot of investment that's not being done that should be. You could have a lot more growth, and a much more inclusive economy, a tighter labor market, all of that. So I think it's possible, but it's not just about what law can you pass. It's a little more complicated than that. It's about, does business, for example, decide that, you know what, it'll reshuffle the decks a little bit, but competing in a way that's more long-term, investment-oriented, right, and more people-friendly will actually get us to a better place.
I still would like to return to the nature of work, because I think the nature of work is changing. And I think the jobs are getting more complicated. So how do we address that? If you're talking about a stationary engineer, they used to be called custodians. 20 years ago, they were manual work. They were manual, skilled. They still are skilled. But the tools they had were the tools they had on their tool belt. Now, if you go and talk to a stationary engineer, they have computers. Instead of knocking at the pipe with the wrench, with great respect, they now are holding handheld gadgets that are actually evaluating the condition and the quality of the system. We're in this beautiful room. The HVAC here is all controlled by computers. So any custodian or stationary engineer now has to understand information technology. And I agree with the Vice President. Everyone can learn. Everyone has skills that enables them to adjust to a different skill set. But how do we help people do that? So I think at the very level, I think education is important, but I also am a great believer in skilled trades. The skilled trades do wonderful training.
Nice
and
education, I mean, across the board.
And it gives people with a different ability, different slant and different proclivity to learn in a different way. But let's also remember, 66% of net new jobs these days are created by small businesses. So the tax policies, the regulations also have an impact. Because if you're only a small business, if you're a small business owner and you only have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 employees, you're impacted by the regulations that impact you and also on the tax rate. So we have to kind of look at that also to ensure that they are, from a macro and microeconomic point of view, conducive to fostering a vibrant economy and good job creation.
And could I pick up on that, Madam Secretary? I couldn't agree more, particularly on the small and medium-sized businesses. It should be a requirement of companies. It is for my company to hire and contract with small and medium-sized businesses. When I spent $1.5 billion in Maryland last year, $500 million of it were with local businesses, small and medium-sized businesses. We didn't have to build to a gold standard from the U.S. Green Building Council, but we did anyway. But to do that requires finding technology companies that you can scale up. On the issue of hourly to management, I just want to touch on that as one of those CEOs that you were kind of defending. First off, my hourly employees, as we know, they make an awful lot of money, and they have my average wages with benefits around $45,000. The challenge a lot of hourly folks have to go into management is the shifts that they have, because a lot of my employees are single-parent families. They're taking care of their kids. Childcare is difficult. So if we want to help the workforce find ways to make life better at home, whether it's better child care opportunities, whether it's taking care of elder care, whether it's getting people back and forth to work because transportation's difficult. I do think there's a huge opportunity there, but I think companies have to take the initiative like mine does. Other companies have to be encouraged or shamed into doing it. And customers need to vote with their feet, like employees. Does the company you go to, a hotel you stay in, a retail store you shop in, do they have your core values? And if they don't, take your business someplace else. I think money matters, and I think that would help.
Folks, the reason I just asked my staff to come around, I wasn't leaving, is that part of the program was supposed to be we're going to shift to questions, and there was going to be questions that had already been collected because we want you engaged, but there haven't been. So if everyone will tolerate, there are questions. Well, bring them up here, man. Let me have them. Oh, you have a microphone, not question. So I invite you to ask anyone on the panel.
May I also
anything
put a
you
plug
want.
in, Mr. Vice President? Could I also put a plug in on
Oh,
community
I'm sorry.
No,
Yes,
no.
no.
Just a small point. On community colleges, this is a wonderful institution of higher learning, but the partnership with the community colleges are also terrific as well. So that was great.
Great point.
As my wife Jill, who teaches full-time like Mary does at community college, she says it's the best kept secret in America. And, you know, I know Delaware is really affordable, but I have a granddaughter who got into Columbia Law School. It's $84,000 a year. I got another granddaughter at the University of Pennsylvania. It's $76,000 a year. I have, you know, I was listed for real as the poorest man in the Congress for 36 years. When I did my financial disclosure, and you'll remember, Senator, as Vice President said, quote, "It's probable no man has ever assumed the office of Vice President with fewer assets than Joe Biden." You can Google it. Washington Post. I assume they weren't talking about intellectual assets. But my point is, the cost of college has exceeded every other bit of inflation, including health care. And in my view, there's no justification for the degree to which it exceeds. Now, presidents don't want to hear that. But the point is that it gets harder and harder and harder to send a kid to, now, a lot of these very well-endowed schools, they're getting in the schools, you get into Harvard now, and whatever it is that you can afford, that's what you pay. Penn is that way now, the heavily endowed schools. But the point is this, that we got to figure out a way, in my view, to give people hope. Just hope. A poll that scared the living devil out of me was a poll where now a majority of the American people think their children's life is not standard is not going to be as high as theirs. Now that's about 8 years old, but the point is, that was never the case before. Never the case before. Those of you with children now or college age, you never thought you'd be in a place where you wondered whether or not your children's standard of living would be lower than yours. So, what I'd like to do, though, is I'd like to open this up to questions from, I'm going to go back between students in the community here, and if you want to ask a general question, fine, but the more specific the question to an individual, and we have a microphone here, and I'm going to, lady in the middle, can you pass it down to her? Is it on? It's useful to hand it to her when it's on.
It's on.
Okay.
Try this one.
Terrified? Hello! Oh God, that's loud. Okay, so I'm a liberal arts major, linguistics to be specific, and it's almost guaranteed that I need to reach higher education in order to pursue the job that I want. I also realize that a male in my position in the workforce can have a degree lower than mine and have the same pay as someone with a higher degree as me. What can we do to lower the gender wage gap while, how can we fix the problem of women needing to spend more money on education to get paid the same as the male counterpart in the positions?
My view on that is well known. And I will happy to answer, but I would yield to the panel. Anyone? Mary Kay? No.
Your view is well known. You've been a fierce advocate for equal pay for women, and the gender disparity you talked about is absolutely wrong. And you just took one step for how we fix it, which is by standing up and asking the question and repeating the disparity. That's one. And two, our experience is one way to deal with that pay gap is in higher ed, having people being able to think together across faculty, students, and with employers on how to eliminate those disparities. And then there have been initiatives in government that help shine a light on this and eradicate it in whole sectors of the economy. I know in our union, we do a lot of work with hospitals and healthcare employers. And even though most of those jobs are female dominated, that same disparity that you talked about exists, where women are having to get masters as opposed to male counterparts that come with BAs in key classifications of jobs where there have been workplace shortages. And the way we've dealt with it is through our collective bargaining agreements, where we point that disparity out and eliminate it. Radiologic technologists is one, registered nursing is another. And it's dealt with by trying to do what Secretary Chao said, which is how do we use the training that people receive at work as credit for college experience and link it to lifelong education, where education comes to the workplace and allows working people to take time off their job to further their education and employment opportunity.
Elaine?
I would, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say, totally agree, it's intolerable. And we don't tolerate it at MGM. You know, men and women make the exact same amount of money for the job that they do, and if I find any time that that does not happen, I change it immediately. We also have, for all vice presidents and above, and we have several thousand of these employees, anytime a job opens, a diversity candidate has to be considered, interviewed and considered, and you have to be deliberate, particularly in progressing women in upper management. And you have to have the right tone at the top. Our board chair on this is a fellow Secretary of Labor, Secretary Alexis Herman, who chairs the committee to ensure at the MGM Resorts Board that we're following through on these commitments. It's despicable, wrong, and long overdue.
I wasn't quite sure whether the question was that you were experiencing this or that you were expecting to experience it. Because if it turns out that you're expecting to experience it, I would hope that you would have hope and not expect that that kind of injustice would always prevail, because that's what all of us on this stage, regardless of philosophical backgrounds, are all fighting for, that there would be better opportunities for everyone. So I hope you don't expect that, and that because that is not right, it should not happen, and if you do encounter it, you must fight it.
So, I'm just being ambitious, and I do want to go into the FBI, so I do understand that I personally will need higher education.
You want to talk to me if you want to go in the FBI.
Okay.
Okay.
But the issue is, like, let's studies, and countless studies, especially in the liberal arts field, that women are being hired in the same positions as men, but the only reason why they are being hired is because they have a master's degree, while the men are being hired with a bachelor's degree. So they have the same position, they're doing the same work, but the women have to get higher education and spend more money in order to get this into the same playing field. And that's the issue.
It's called discrimination.
Yeah.
No, I'm not being facetious. Look, I am one of those guys who believes we can change the culture. I really mean it. The millennial generation is the most open, most progressive, volunteers the most, is most open-minded. By every measure, you sociologists, professors out there measure it, by every measure, it is the most progressive generation in American history, by a long shot. Not the vaulted 60s generation when I graduated from here and Haight Asbury and we were going to change things, which we did, by the way. But I have hope because it goes to what Jim talked about and what the Secretary talked about. It goes to the tolerance level here. Look, think of this as an analogy. 10 years ago, if you, those of you who are not students, but in the business community or in the community, if you attended a luncheon, a professional luncheon with 4 or 5 of your colleagues on a matter, whether it was business or philanthropy or whatever it was, and a gay waiter came up to you, and I'm not being facetious here now, and said, "What would you like for lunch?" And if one of the people in your group said, "Oh, let me tell you," you wouldn't have said anything. Today, that person would be ostracized. Not a joke. Because the vast majority of people are not homophobic, yet they were afraid to speak up to be singled out as the person who is the odd man out. When I came out for gay marriage, look what's changed, whether you agree with me or not. Within a matter of 2 years, everything, including the interpretation of the Supreme Court, the Constitution changed. Totally different world. The reason I spend so much time in violence against women, so much of my time, is because we can change the culture. Because it's cultural. You all know what the phrase rule of thumb means? It was English common law in the late 1300s. Too many women were being beaten to death by their husbands because they were chattel, just like the cow or the horse or the dog. So the court of common law came along and said you can no longer beat your, quote, woman with a stick bigger than the circumference of your thumb. It's part of our culture. It's a culture. But it's changing. Woman helped me write that bill. Cynthia Hogan was the one who went and began to clean up the NFL. 10 years ago, when that guy dragged his wife out of that elevator by the hair, nothing would have happened. Seriously, think about it. Nothing would have happened. He did it, and the whole world came down on his head and on the head of the owners. Doesn't mean the problem's solved. But that's beginning to happen now. You see what's happening in Silicon Valley. There's so few women equally as competent. There's the Sheryl Sandbergs of the world that are exceptions, but who hold executive positions. There's an expression, I'll end with this. There's an old Chinese expression. It says, women hold up half the sky. Women hold up half the sky. And there's a new rule of physics as it applies to economic growth for nations. Any nation that does not take advantage of 50% of its brain power, 50% of its capability, 50% of its energy, will not succeed in the 21st century. It's not an American rule. It's not Joe Biden about equal rights rule. It's just a simple fact of life. I've met every major world leader in the last 44 years. There's not one I have not known. I was recently in Japan, actually 2.5 years ago. I've been there a lot. Guess what? Those of you who are Japanese know that Japanese women are as well educated as the men. But they have a child, they're expected to drop out of the workforce. Well, all of a sudden, as they say in southern Delaware, they're seeing Jesus. They have an epiphany. Because guess what? They don't have enough replacement workers. Yeah. They cannot compete. So now Abenomics is to try to change the culture in Japan to encourage women to stay in the workforce. So there's a lot of things that are changing. And we can propel the change more rapidly. This is where we can argue about legislation. I think there should be legislation relating to equal pay for equal work, but that's another, I don't want to get into all that. But the generic point I'm saying is that things are changing. I did 6 commencements this year. I do about 5 or 6 a year. I did Harvard, Yale, Colby, Morgan State, Cornell. And guess what? On average, I went back and looked at the last 10 years, my commencements, 78% of the valedictorians were women. 78% in all those schools. What's happening now is there are more women in college than men. So guess what, folks? Times are a-changing. And you guys better get with it. Or you're going to get run over. Not a joke. So continue to speak up.
Yeah.
Continue to speak up.
Vice President Biden, I just want to add that related to your last point, where standards are more based on performance rather than just discretion, women do a lot better. You may have heard about the experiment with symphony orchestras. the top symphony orchestras had very few women, and then some of them started to do a blind curtain, so you couldn't tell who the person was playing. You just listened to their music when they were auditioning, a blind audition, and it something like tripled the number of women who were taken on in symphony orchestras because the people who were making the decision felt they didn't quite look like a musician. They weren't hearing it properly because they were confused by what they were seeing. And so like actually having it blind, and we've seen that, again, I talk about how everyone should have a chance to show what they can do, right? And then you hire there. Women do much better in that system, right? Because it turns out that like the coding boot camps, for example, they're double the number of women getting, in those than there are in engineering programs because it's performance-based, right? And and so I just think, and you've seen it actually with minorities too. I work with an IT outsourcing operation who basically hires anyone. You can hire, they advertise on Craigslist, Pizza Hut. It's all performance-based. Like there's 10 minutes of HR to make sure you're an actual human, not a bot, and you have the right to work in the United States. But other than that, it's total performance-based, and then they onboard you, they train you, and by the way, they get only 13% annual turnover versus about 40% of that industry. They are doubling revenues every year for the last 3 years. They're twice as profitable as their competitors because turnover, to your point, is a huge driver of it. And by the way, they started in Metro Baltimore, which is 27% African American. 25% of their software developers are African American, right? Because they go for performance. And there's a bunch of other things that we say are meritocracy, but are a whole bunch of other things. They're about how much money you have, how much staying power, how much social support. And so I would just encourage wherever you can not only advocate for equal pay for women, but also for just basically equal opportunity to show what you can do for everybody, I think women will do very well in that setup.
I think if you, we'll take one more question, but I think if you think about it, all you women who have done so incredibly well and come through the old system, I'll bet you can tell without being told whether the man on the job would treat you as an equal, whether he was raised by, and I'm not joking, raised by or raised with strong women. Not a joke. Think about all you women, think about that. The person you work with alongside you, the one who you think really genuinely respects you. I'll lay 8 to 5 that had a sister like Valerie. Not a joke. Not a joke. Or had a wife with a couple of master's degrees and a doctorate degree. Or had a mother who had a backbone like a ramrod. No, but I really mean it. Think about it. And this is part of changing the culture. Emboldening women to stand up. One more question. We're way over time. And you're being very polite. A student. That was a student. Right here? No, I'm going with the military.
We tagged him this question.
He's okay?
Yeah, well, we both figured we'd raise our hands that we'd have a better chance.
All right.
All right.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. With thousands of disabled veterans leaving the military, getting an education, and returning to the civilian workforce, what advice can you give us to ensure our future success, especially when transferring skills into employment for the future?
I can quickly answer that question and then let Elaine do that department. Speaking of strong women, and I mean this sincerely, my wife Jill started an organization with Michelle Obama for military families because 1% of the population has fought every war we've had the last 17 years. 1%. And what happens is the children of, the spouses of, male or female, of that deployed veteran, in case of my son, deployed for a year, and before that as a civilian deployed in Kosovo for almost a year. What happens is everybody around you, life is normal. Everything's okay. Dad or mom's home for Christmas. They're there for the birthdays. School plays. Everything's fine. But the truth is, and I carry a card, I don't have it with me now because I changed my suit, Every single morning for the last 12 years, I get up, I contact my staff, be precise, contacts the Defense Department. I want to know the exact number, not a generic number, the exact number of people who have been killed in Afghanistan, Iran, or in the war against terror, other places, Iraq, an exact number of people who have been wounded. Because every single one of those individuals left behind a whole community. So Jill still runs this organization nationally, along with a community college organization she's running. She's now chair of Save the Children USA. And by the way, she teaches 15 credits. The phrase she uses is, everyone can do one simple act of kindness. When Bo was deployed, Christmas time, or after Christmas, one of the first snowstorms that came along, my daughter-in-law with 2 little kids looks out the window and the neighbor's shoveling the driveway. Didn't say a word, just shovel the driveway. So many people, when they deploy in the National Guard, they leave businesses. Their spouse left behind, male or female, may not have enough money for the diapers or to take the kids to the movies. So that's why they started an organization called Boots on the Ground. But the core thing that I'm so proud of what they did was, it used to be, if you are the best, as Jim said, the best trained people in the world are our military. And that's not hyperbole. They're the single most significant, greatest force of warriors in the history of the world in terms of their training, their equipment, and their capacity. So, you got one guy who's a master sergeant, and he may be in control of 20 tanks worth over $250 million. He comes home and he can't get a job with Parcel Post. Or a welder in the U.S. Navy. He or she comes home, they have to get licensed in Delaware, then licensed where they changed. Well, that's changed now because of Jill and Michelle. If you're a licensed military, it's good enough. You automatically. Because guess what happens? You can't, every single state you move to, every camp you switch to, have to go through the entire process of qualifying all over again. There's 1,000 little things that are being done now to change the quality of life for people returning home and people being deployed, including the most important one, and that is there is a guarantee for your education. Flat out guarantee. You find me anybody who's a veteran, who's been denied, call me. I promise you. I promise you they'll get into Delaware or Wilmington College or something. I guarantee it. I guarantee. So the point is that things are changing. It's not like when I was here, my Vietnam generation, people would come home and literally at the airport, not a joke, get spat upon in their uniform. Today, we're reaching out. But as the war's tamped down, folks, we still have close to 40,000 people in harm's way. There's still a kid like my little Hunter going to bed at night crying for where's daddy or where's mommy. And the difference between this generation of warriors and any others, not deployed once, but twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. I've been in and out of Afghanistan and Iraq over 36 times. I've been in and out of Bosnia and Kosovo and Herzegovina when the war was going on 28 times. Last time flying in to Bagram Air Force Base, I'm up in the cockpit with the load masters, pilots, co-pilots, navigators. And I asked a question, and I said, how many of you is this your first tour? Nobody raised their hand. Second tour, 1. Third tour, 1. Fourth tour, 3. The rest had 5 tours. We owe these folks. And here's the last point I'll make. Stiglitz, a leading economist in the country, estimated based upon the injuries, 70% of the injuries suffered in Afghanistan and Iraq, if suffered in Vietnam, you would have died. But because of we call the golden hour, that we get these guys and women out within an hour, we get them all the way to Landstuhl, Germany. They're living. But they're going to require extensive medical help and care the rest of their lives. And soon, God willing, we'll finally be out of these places. I pray to God. And the parades will be over and the streets will have been named. But there's still going to be we have 300,000 have come home with traumatic brain injury or PSD. Stiglitz estimated 3 years ago, that's a minimum $7 billion commitment to make sure their health care is. So you guys, when you're 55 and pray God there's not a war going on, and you get a bill from the VA and they say it costs X amount of dollars, you better damn well pay it. You better damn well pay it. As we did in this war, Republican and Democrat, we haven't done in previous wars. We made sure we agreed we would take care of it. My whole generation, or Agent Orange, unless you could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the deficiency in your immune system is caused by that agent that dropped on your head to defoliate the forest, the jungle, you couldn't collect. So I introduced a bill as a senator just before I got to be vice president. I said, anyone who has traumatic brain injury and can prove it, a doctor, all they have to show was they were in a region where there was concussion. IEDs is the reason this happened. They don't have to prove direct correlation. They went and they didn't have traumatic brain injury. They came back with traumatic brain injury. And they were in a war zone where there were massive explosions. And then I did something with 2 other people, including John McCain and your husband's leadership. We said all those folks who had acid rain drop on them, finally, they'd be covered free at the VA. They didn't have to prove. That was one of the reasons why we had this catastrophe in terms of so many people trying to get to the VA. We were trying to make up for the sins we committed by not taking care of them. You've been an incredibly patient audience. I want you to do as a favor for me, thank these incredible people who made their way here. Thank you. And as President Sonis can tell you the bad news, I'm going to be on campus more this semester. So don't pretend you don't know me when you can walk up to me in the mall, okay? Thank you all very much. Love you all. Proud of my university.